Welcome to Your Cyber Path, the podcast that helps you get your dream cybersecurity job by sharing the secrets of experienced hiring managers and top cybersecurity professionals with you. Now, on to the show.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Your Cyber Path. I'm Kip Boyle, and today I'm here actually without Jason Dion, who is typically here to share what he knows with you, but he's taking a well-deserved vacation. So we're pressing on with the next episode. This is episode 83, and the working title is Automating the NIST Risk Management Framework. And we've got a guest who actually works with the risk management framework a lot and has some insider knowledge on a particular tool that sort of advertises itself as a way of automating the risk management framework. Her name is Rebecca Onuskanich, and I hope the heck I said that right. Good, Rebecca. So welcome. We're so glad you're here. Would you please tell the audience a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Kip. Thanks for having me. So as you mentioned, I do work with the risk management framework. Particularly at this point in time, I'm working specifically in the Department of Defense. So most of my work is the Department of Defense's interpretation of the RMF process. I have worked in the federal agencies for quite a bit of years, but now I'm back in the DoD. I started working in this space long before it was ever called the RMF process. So I've been in DoD security compliance and information assurance for well over 20 years. So I've seen it transition from very much paperwork process to where we're getting to this point of trying to automate the security configuration and compliance requirements.
Again, I'm really happy you're here because you're bringing a real depth of expertise to this topic for the benefit of our audience. And I recall my first experiences working kind of in this space when I was on active duty in the Air Force. And let's just say it was primitive compared to what we're attempting to do now. Well, listen, everybody, as a reminder, we've covered what RMF is in depth back in episode 80. So I'm going to do a quick recap, but if you want to really go into RMF as far as what it is and what does it require, I really encourage you to go back to episode 80 and listen to that. But just to give you a thumbnail sketch, in case you haven't listened to that episode or it's been a while, RMF provides a process that integrates security, privacy, and cyber supply chain risk management activities all into a systems development lifecycle. And there's 7 steps in the process. So I'll recap them now. And Rebecca, you can chime in and tell me if I get any of this wrong, because I know you have more experience with it than I do. But the first step is you have to prepare your organization to manage security and privacy risks. The second step is you have to categorize your system and the information that it processes, stores, and transmits. The third step is you got to get into NIST Special Publication 800-53, which is a catalog of controls, and you have to select the ones that are going to help you reduce risk. Step number 4 is you implement the controls and you document how they're deployed. Step number 5 is you assess to determine if the controls are in place, that they're operating as they're supposed to, and that you're getting the correct results from them. Step number 6 is a senior official then is asked to make a risk-based decision to authorize the system to operate, to become a production system. And then the 7th step is to continuously monitor the implementation of your controls and to make sure that the risks to your system stay reasonable. What do you think, Rebecca? Was that an okay summary?
That was perfect. Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So now what I want to do is I want to really get into the essence of this episode, which is to talk about using a particular tool to automate some of this work, because there's a lot to do here. And when we were doing pre-show prep, Rebecca was saying to me, Kip, this tool called eMASS, it probably doesn't automate as much as people might think, which is kind of surprising to me. I haven't used eMASS, but Rebecca, I was hoping you could kind of unpack that a little bit and tell people, what does that mean?
Yeah, so eMASS does definitely support the framework and walking through the actual RMF process. And you can do things like when you put your system into eMASS, once you have a hardware list and a software list, and you do your Nessus vulnerability scanners, you do your security technical implementation guide or your state checklist, you can import that data into eMASS, and then it will correlate those findings. So let's say that you run an ACAS scan and there is a vulnerability associated with the software or a piece of hardware. It will associate that security control with that piece of software as a non-compliant item. But it's not going to actually do things like write all of your security documentation for you on how you do identification and authentication. You actually got to do that work to put it into eMASS.
I see. Okay, so maybe eMASS would be better characterized as just like a data store and just a way to organize yourself. Do you think that's a more accurate description of what it does?
Yeah, it does definitely keep all of your data, all of your system identification information. Like you do security categorization in there. So we're talking step one, preparing. That's when we build our system in eMASS. When we start to move it, or step zero, prepare. Step one, we start to look at actually getting our team together. That's when we assign all of the individuals in eMASS. And then we, add things like our system name, start looking at what version are we working on, what network is it going on. And then we move into that categorization phase. eMASS does a very good job of helping us categorize our system and based on the NIST specification 860 volume 2, and then select our security controls from there.
Okay. So eMASS is helpful, I guess, is my takeaway from this part of our conversation. And so it's worth us, spending some more time on the episode now to, kind of understand it a little bit better. And I suppose I should probably stop at this point and tell people that eMASS is an acronym, and it actually stands for Enterprise Mission Assurance Support Service. I'm sure, Rebecca, you probably have other names for it, probably in frustration, but that's I think that's the proper name. So let's talk about how you use RMF in your work before we really start talking about eMASS, because my understanding is RMF and eMASS are kind of a one size fits all sort of a thing, but not everybody's doing the same kind of work at the same scale. So how do you use RMF and let's start there.
Yeah. So I come from a tactical world. So I come from we've got a mission coming up. It starts on Sunday. We have to get a system authorized and out to the field for a military user. And so when we use RMF in that process, it's much more agile. It's how to be adapted to be flexible. And it's all mission focused. And when we start looking at system categorization, it's more based not only just around confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but we are also looking at the mission aspect of that. So when you start thinking about things like weapon systems, IoT, you have very unique requirements in those systems where they can't necessarily implement what would be selected from a baseline categorization from a CI perspective. So that's when tailoring comes in. Tailoring is a huge part of the control selection process that, in my experience, a lot of people forget that RMF is a framework that is to be adapted by organizations, and it provides the executive leadership in those organizations to make decisions on how they're going to adapt that framework for their systems and their missions. And that's really what's left out a lot in the DoD's implementation and interpretation of the RMF.
Is this tailoring aspect that people are expected to adapt the RMF to their specific situation. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, and I would think that especially newer people to RMF would actually find that maybe a little bit intimidating or maybe a little bit like scary, because it's like, no, I want a checklist. What do you mean it's not a checklist, right? I mean, do you think that's part of maybe what's going on?
Yeah, and like you, I was Air Force before and enlisted, and everything is standard operating procedure, TTP. We follow a checklist. You don't deviate from the checklist because there's safety concerns, there's mission concerns. So when we talk cybersecurity and RMF, and it being such an interpretable process, it's very difficult for us to kind of adapt our mindset to be able to say, wait, we can actually critically think about the system design aspects, the security requirements, the mission, the users, and put all that together. And as a team, sit down and decide what is the tailoring aspects of the system, the baseline and the tailored controls, and then get that authorizing official or that AO's buy-in very early. So we designed a system where it is not over-engineered from a security perspective, but is also protecting the data, the users, and the mission.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think there's a risk that as people try to tailor RMF for their situation, that that they might make some big mistakes as far as like they might leave things out that they really shouldn't leave out? I mean, is there a lot of risk, that people are really going to mess up the tailoring?
Yes, tailoring is one of those things, and that's why we have such a hard time with it, the DoD. And I have seen instances where things have been tailored out that actually increase the risk to the user on the system. And that has to be sent to the authorizing official to help make that determination. Because there is a cost to all of this, right?
Yeah.
And especially as someone who's worked as, a security manager, security engineer, we don't think costs, we don't think budget, we don't think schedules. And that's where we're having a pretty large disconnect in the DoD, is that we have our main area of expertise and our focus, and we're concerned on securing data, connections, users, risk, cost and schedules. That's program managers, that's program office, that's not our concern. And that's where we really start to disconnect in the DoD.
Okay. This is so helpful. I mean, I think for anybody who hasn't worked with RMF for very long, or maybe they have and they just find it really frustrating, I would hope this conversation would be really helpful to them to get them grounded, right, on how you actually do this stuff. I'm interested though, Rebecca, would you kind of tell us how you got into RMF? Like, where did RMF start for you? Because to your point, you started doing this work before RMF came along, but how did you and RMF meet?
Yeah, I was actually military intelligence, and I took an assignment working for Central Command, and I got into it when it was still called information assurance. So before the cybersecurity terminology.
I remember that.
Yes. So back in the pre-DITSCAP, then DITSCAP, and then DICAP days. And then actually I got into RMF when I separated from the Air Force and started working for the federal agencies. And so they were already following the 800-37 framework at that time. And so I had to learn their process and how they do things. And then once I learned that, and the DoD switched to the 85-1001 under the RMF, I started getting a lot more clients who were selling to the DoD who needed to understand this new RMF process and how to secure and sell to the Department of Defense.
Okay. Well, and that's another interesting story that I would love to talk with you about. Probably not during the episode today, but I think what you said is that you're actually a business owner, right? That you kind of launched your own company in order to help, but from a civilian point of view. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
And you know what? I don't see a lot of people who leave the military who start their own businesses. I think that's a fairly uncommon thing. That's what I did eventually, but it took me a while to get there. But I just want to congratulate you for taking the road less traveled. So I just think it's really cool. Yeah, you're welcome. So let's move on. Let's continue to unpack this. How does RMF work in the real world? And I think a big part of that is something you said earlier, which is, okay, well, we've got RMF, it's documented, we have to tailor it, but it's kind of a one size fits all thing. It doesn't really anticipate, every use case. But so how do you actually use it, right? How do you make the best use of it, given that it's such a slippery kind of thing?
So right now I'm in a situation that I am actually starting to help the acquisition community. So the acquisition community puts on government contracts the requirement for security, right?
Mhm.
And typically in the past, there would be, you have to comply with DoD 85-1001. Well, okay, that's a very, very large assumption is made there that anyone even understands the instruction to begin with, and then how to interpret it and how to, select their baseline and then tailor. So
Mhm.
what we've been working on recently is developing acquisition language so that when something gets put on contracts, the contractor, the integrator, the developer, even a small business like me, I understand exactly what I'm selling to the government. Because something as simple as the encryption type that I have to build into software can vastly change the cost, right? So if I have to bring in someone that understands a type 2 encryptor versus a 640 encryption mechanism, the cost of that type of engineer varies significantly, the
Yeah.
amount of time it'll take to develop. So actually getting into the acquisition cycle is going to be key to actually being able to implement RMF correctly across the DoD.
Mm.
And right now there's a lot of, I don't want to say animosity, but there is quite a bit of frustration with the RMF process in the DoD. And I really think that's because the way that when it was rolled out, it was the way it was trained
Uh-huh.
to all of the security managers. It was very much checklist mentality. Let's categorize the system. No real tailoring was implemented. It was a very rigid interpretation of the framework.
So we're kind of our own worst enemies, right? Going back to a previous part of our conversation where we were talking about how necessary it is to tailor it, but that the dominant culture is to not do that. The dominant culture is to be very rigid and to follow checklists. And what I'm hearing you say is, yeah, that's actually how they trained us to do it, which is not very enabling of the intent. And yeah, so I could see a lot of people would be frustrated by that for sure. So, okay. So is that how you were trained? And how did you work through that to be able to use RMF the way it was intended versus the way you were trained?
I think that for me, I think it was my leadership
Mhm.
and the fact that I come from a tactical environment. It was fast moving. Our leadership all the way up the chain understood that security is a priority, but also mission effectiveness is a higher priority. So
Yeah.
trying to balance those two things, we were able to have those very open conversations as to, okay, that's fine. We don't have time to acquire this encryption that we need, or we don't have time to implement this, AV solution. And if you want to field it, that's a risk. And we have to understand what are the consequences of those risks. And so having the leadership in place that understood that we could make these trade-offs, but we needed to understand what we were trading off to ensure that we are doing our due diligence to protect the data, the users, and the missions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in other words, my interpretation of what you just said is, well, I went and got this training on RMF, and then I went to the real world, and the real world said, we have to do you have to do things a little differently because real world, right? We've got to balance all these competing priorities, and at the end of the day, we've got to accomplish the mission, right? Whatever that takes. And so those are the real world, kind of trade-offs that a person has to make. So yeah, so I guess maybe something that I would say to people is if you're learning RMF, or maybe you've already been through the training and you're struggling with it, what I'm hearing is, lean into the reality of the situation that you're in and draw what you can from RMF, but don't be such a slave to RMF that you can't get your mission accomplished. Is that like a reasonable way to kind of summarize what you were saying?
Yes, it is. Oh, and the one thing I'm always very adamant about telling people is to make sure you're truthful. So even when you're putting together like your security plan, if you're not doing something, annotate it in there, document it, be truthful, you know, do a risk analysis on it, determine what risks it bring to the system, um, and what are some of the mitigations that can be put into place. And then document all of that so you can communicate that up to leadership because, as you mentioned earlier, that authorizing official has to sign off on it and they need to actually understand the reality of the
Right.
situation not a clouded view.
Yeah. And it's not reasonable to expect an authorizing official to really even understand RMF, is it?
I think, yes, I mean, a part of their training to be an authorizing official, they're supposed to actually take training in the RMF process. And those that I have worked with recently are pretty aware of the RMF process and frustrated with it, right? Because it is holding up some progress. It is making the system development life cycle take longer.
Yeah. Okay.
And from my experience, that's all that hold up is in the middle tier. It's all of those middle. The leadership, they want to be able to make those decisions quickly. They want to be able to move quickly. But we're holding it up in the middle with this whole checklist mentality problem we're having.
Okay. Right. And you'd mentioned that before. Now, in DoD anyway, you had told me previously when we were talking about the episode here, we're doing our preparations, and you said DoD has some initiatives to try and address these issues and to actually revise RMF. What are you seeing?
Yeah, we're seeing what's called RMS 2.0. We're seeing the fast track RMF or fast track ATO. We're seeing continuous ATO. So depending on where you're at in the DoD, it's being called a different name. But really, if you kind of peel all the layers to it, what it means is do very good system security engineering, design systems that can be continuously monitored, monitor those systems, monitor the risk, continue to report that risk up. And then your ATO should continue to flow.
Okay. Now let's define that term for a moment, ATO, because I don't think we've defined it yet, but we've been using it. So what's ATO?
So your ATO is your authorization to operate. So for the DoD, it's what allows you to take a system and actually use it as a DoD entity. So whether that's a standalone system or it's connected to some type of network or cloud environment.
Okay, got it. So do you have an opinion of your own as far as, RMF 2.0, fast track ATO, continuous ATO? Do you think that they're headed in the right direction in terms of addressing what the real, issue is with RMF and making it more useful?
I mean, any steps for an improvement are helpful, obviously. Some of those processes have kind of a subset of control in the beginning that are implemented. And then as you move through your ATO process, you implement more and more security controls. But really, a lot of that should have been done in the development life cycle. If we're developing software or a system that has multiple pieces of software, we should have already have done most of that. So I think the initiatives are good. I don't think they're, the final be all that'll get us to where we need to be. I honestly believe that a lot of it is coming down to the training.
Okay. That's really interesting. So again, it's not that RMF itself is so much of an issue. It's just the culture, the institution, right? Trying to evolve itself to this kind of more flexible approach. And okay, well that's fascinating. And hopefully with time, maybe these two things will meet in the middle. RMF will change a little bit, and the culture will change a little bit, and we'll be able to get someplace. One thing that I was curious about, and this is a little off the cuff question here to you, but I've been thinking about the difference between RMF and the NIST cybersecurity framework, and some people have said to me, well, actually, they're kind of complementary. And I think to myself, well, they're definitely different. And so I suppose they could be complementary. Whereas RMF is focused on the development lifecycle, and the cybersecurity framework is really more about an incident orientation. So do you think that the NIST cybersecurity framework would be a good way to do step 7, the continuously monitor step in RMF, or how do you think about the way these two frameworks kind of fit up to each other?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely have their place. They're both a little bit different from each other, but they do complement each other. And I do think that I am actually seeing more entities in the DoD start looking at the CSF, so the cybersecurity framework, and how to bring that into that continuous monitoring phase.
Okay, so you do think that that's a natural touch point for these two frameworks is that step 7 continuous monitoring. Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. I was I was trying to figure that out for myself. All right, so let's see. When we were doing show prep, you had mentioned a few other things that I think our audience would really benefit from hearing about, which is some examples around some of the difficulties of legacy systems in RMF, and the fact that you've got systems that are no longer in a development state, right? Their development is finished, and maybe they'll never be enhanced again. And yet you're still expected to use a SDLC style approach to achieving approval to operate. What's that been like for you? How do you deal with a situation like that?
It's been a struggle for everybody involved, right? So we have systems in the DoD that are, I mean, designed and deployed in the 60s, the 70s, or
Back when
they're not even running on. Exactly. So a lot of them are still running on the platform. And so when you take something that can only take a 6-digit password and you try to say, well, you have to put a 14-character password on it, how much development expense do you put in finding a developer, first of all? And then, I mean, are you actually improving the security of that system? Is it really a necessary requirement for that system? And a lot of that, as we're going through, and that's where I believe the training problem is coming into play, because those that are saying, okay, you have to come to my organization as a security controls assessor, and I'm doing your independent assessment, and you only have a 6-character password or even PIN on your system, you fail. Well, do you really fail if the system isn't capable of doing that? And so that is where we're really struggling in the DoD, is that kind of, that's why I said earlier, that middle tier where I have to send my system to an assessor with no idea. They're right out of college, maybe they're a new airman. This is a new position, and I'm trying to explain. And that's why it's very important that in that documentation, you say, you clearly state the system is, legacy. It can't support a 14-character password. And this is a very simple example. That's
right.
Very true, but
it is. And, Rebecca, as you talk about this, I'm reminded of some experiences I've had in the private sector where I had a customer who was going through a payment card industry data security standard audit, right? Because they wanted to conform to the PCI DSS. And similar things, this was a while ago, but there would be a mainframe computer that was processing credit card transactions, and it was legacy, and it just couldn't, whether it was a password or just some other things, it just could not perform to all of the requirements in PCI DSS. And so we had to figure out how to create compensating controls and do other things in order to meet the intent of the requirement, knowing that the requirement itself was not going to be met in a very, inside that system. And so that sounds very similar to what you said. Right? That's the thing, isn't it?
Same. That everyone's having the problem. Medical community's having it. Anybody that is trying to meet a compliance standard that is built on modern development processes and platforms are having the same issue.
Right. Okay. So listen, for anybody out there who has experience working in PCI DSS or HIPAA or what have you, where you're trying to take a framework and you're trying to, get a legacy system to conform to it. Well, if you come over to RMF, welcome to the party, because it sounds like it's going to just be more of the same. RMF does another thing too, which I thought was really interesting. These days we talk about advanced persistent threats and we talk about zero trust, and those things really bring up this idea of assume breach, right? As a philosophy, right? Because for so long we've been in this mindset that we're assuming that a system is not breached, so we can build nice walls around it, right? And keep it pure. But we've realized that that's just not the way the world works anymore. But during the show prep, you were saying, yeah, unfortunately, RMF kind of hasn't really caught up to the reality of assumed breach. Did I get that right?
Yes. Yeah. So it's not looking at advanced persistent threat. So that's why in the DoD, and not to throw us off track at all, but we are really starting to look at resiliency and survivability.
Okay.
Of systems.
And that's NIST cybersecurity framework is really designed around resilience and I don't know that they ever used the term assume breach in there exactly, but they certainly do emphasize the fact that, it's not all about prevention, that you have to detect, respond, and recover as well, and be prepared to do those things and as fast as you can, because that really matters in terms of being able to survive. Okay, so now we get to the part that we really, really we're aiming at, which is eMASS, right? What is eMASS? Who should use it, and what are its limitations? What are the things that are really good about it? So, hi, Rebecca, I'm new. What's eMASS?
So the first thing to understand about eMASS is it is what we call a government off-the-shelf system. So you can't go and buy it from a commercial vendor. It is developed for the DoD by DoD contractors, available to DoD users on DoD systems. So if you were, an integrator or a small business trying to use eMASS or, teach yourself how to use it, you can't do that. It has to be from a DoD network. And so really what it does is it helps walk you through those 7 steps.
Okay.
So you start by registering your system, and it's very access control oriented. Restrictions are pretty tight around permissions. So like right now, one of my organizations I work with is very small. There are 2 of us. And so we have to get multiple roles in eMASS to be able to do all the jobs and work the system through the process.
So are you having to log out and log back in depending on what step you're trying to accomplish? Is it that?
No, they're able to actually give you the permissions under one account, thankfully. But it's very permission based, which it obviously should be, right? We're trying to prevent me from being able to say, oh, I'm doing this, for this control and I do it really well. And, oh, let me just go ahead and assess myself. You got to have a separation of duty.
Right. Yeah. Listening to you talk about using eMASS when you were such a small organization makes me think about maybe like a 2-person startup who says, let's use Salesforce for our CRM. It's like, wait a minute. That's a highly scaled system and probably not the best place for you to start. When I talk with mid-market companies about doing different things for cybersecurity, sometimes they'll say to me, well, what if we get, XYZ product because, that's very popular and all the big companies use it. And I say, I understand why you say that, but that's kind of like putting your 14-year-old son into his dad's suit and sending him off to, the junior high dance. It's really not going to work. It's just, that suit was never designed for such a small kid. He's going to look silly. And worse yet, I mean, it can be so expensive to use something that's been sized beyond the scale that you're operating at. And so what I'm hearing is that if you're a small organization, eMASS can kind of feel like you're wearing, too big of a dress.
Yeah. But on the other end, if you are, so we work a lot with system of systems. I don't know if you've ever talked about that in any of your podcasts.
We haven't. Tell us what that is, please.
So a system of systems is if you think about Navy ships, a good example, right? It is a system. The ship is a system in its own, but there are thousands of systems on that ship that have to work together.
Right.
Some are standalone, some are working together, some are communicating back home. But that is what we call a system of systems. These all have to work together. So eMASS doesn't do a great job of looking at risk across that entire enterprise system of systems either. So it's really right in that mid-level development size of system that it works really well in.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So in my brain, I think of like subsystems, right? Because you can't really operate a ship without all these subsystems and kind of how they integrate with each other. If Jason Dion was here, he'd be all over this because as a person who is just retired from the Navy, he could probably tell us all kinds of really cool stories about, how subsystems on ships don't work the way they're supposed to or what have you. But let's get back to eMASS. So what I'm hearing is eMASS is not something you can buy without a prescription. And I'm hearing that eMASS is like kind of complicated and a little difficult to kind of get your arms around. And that the only way you're going to get into eMASS is if you apply to somebody in the government, right, to issue you an account, and they probably won't do that unless you've got some kind of contract you're working on. Is that about right?
Yes, and typically you have to have a DoD CAC. So
Okay.
it is CAC.
Okay, and that's a common access. Is it common access card?
Or
Okay, common access card, right? So that's like a smart card, is it not? Because
it is.
they didn't have these things when I was on active duty, so I've heard about them, but I've never actually had one. And is eMASS web-based, or is it like a piece of software you install on your local computer?
It is a web-based app. Yep.
Okay, got that. Okay, cool. And now, what else about eMASS? About using eMASS? I mean, are there any, like, in your experience, any particular gotchas or tips or tricks? I mean, like, again, hi Rebecca, I'm using eMASS for the first time. What should I know? What else would you tell me so I can be successful?
So it's gonna depend on when you come in the life cycle of your system. So if you come in new to an organization and all of their systems are already built in eMASS, let's say you already have an ATO, you'll be working on continuous monitoring. So there are requirements to review the security controls at a prescripted time. So let's say every 3 years, you're required to review your security policies. Every year, you're required to review your access control rosters. So in eMASS, we actually go in there and validate that we are reviewed those. But if you're building a new system in eMASS, you have to request the access. You've got to have somebody build the initial system for you. So let's say, your system is, whatever you want to call it, new DoD system 2. And then you sit down and you categorize the system and tailor it in there, and then that gets approved. And so once we call it your security controls baseline tailored, once that's been approved, then the work starts.
Okay.
The implementation, right? So you've got to write security policies. You've got to have SOPs and TTPs. You got to know what we refer to as harden the system, or you utilize the STIGs, the security technical implementation guides. So you've got to have a software and hardware baseline, and you put that into eMASS. Actually, you will actually put in there, I'm using, this Dell version, this model, this is the OS that's running on it. This is the patch level the OS is on. You put all of that information in there, and you start to build your hardware and software list. You'll build what they call the authorization boundary.
Okay.
So you have to actually say, here's all the components, hardware, software, firmware. Here's how they're connecting. Here's all my ports I'm using. Here's all the protocols we're using.
Wow.
So all of this data that supports the system security plan goes into eMASS, and you're essentially building your system security plan in eMASS.
And this also sounds like a really heavy duty configuration control sort of an approach too, right? Because I'm hearing you say, like, you're putting, all these component items right in there down to the patch level, and getting this all in there. And I can see why that would be an advantage. But I'm also just sort of fatigued just thinking about, all of the information that I'm going to have to, pound into eMASS. So fascinating. Well, then that actually brings up a question that I wanted to ask you as we get to the end of our episode today, which is there any risks to using eMASS to manage risks?
The number one concern right now is, okay, now I'm putting all of my systems, all of the software, the versions, IP addresses, boundary diagrams, ports, protocols, services, how I'm authenticating my users, my encryption type. I'm putting every single design and system security engineering aspect into one web-based application, which in itself has some vulnerabilities, right? That it's web-based. Now you want me to put all of that together along with everyone else's stuff. And really, you have built a treasure chest for the adversary to get to. It is a crown jewel with what piece of software on the web.
Right. I wonder if anybody used eMASS to assess eMASS.
I do know it has an ETO.
Oh, well, that's good. Okay, so that's eMASS. Just a quick question. Are there other ways that you can automate RMF or just make it easier for yourself other than eMASS?
So Exacta is one of the tools that you'll see being used across the DoD. The federal side has their own tools. So they have CSAM. I could not tell you what it stands for.
Okay.
So, and then some organizations develop their own internal systems where they'll use things like a SharePoint. I've seen, custom build workflow processes. I've seen CRM be leveraged to build a workflow process for this.
Okay, so eMASS is really optional then, is what I'm hearing. That there's other that that RMF doesn't require you to use eMASS, and that you can sort of bring whatever automation you'd like to the party. Is that right?
Well, that was correct.
Oh,
Now it's starting. Now it's starting. More services are starting to require it. So across the Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, because like I mentioned, RMF is an interpretable process. So every community has kind of decided what tools and which processes they're going to use. eMASS is just a DoD funded tool. And I do have a couple of organizations I work with now who don't use eMASS, but they have been mandated to move to it, and they are on a large initiative to move everything over to eMASS. And they're very nervous about it.
okay, okay. And probably in a couple of years, we'll be talking about, how everyone's using eMASS now, and, different sets of problems. So the whole thing just really strikes me as a bit of a moving target, right?
It's been moving for 20 years. So,
Well, welcome to cybersecurity, because that's just sort of the nature of the beast, isn't it? Everything is always moving. Well, we're running out of time. Rebecca, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm again really thankful that you've decided to spend some of your valuable time talking with me today, making this recording this episode so that people can benefit from your experience. Is there anything else you want to share, just like a final word before we wrap up?
my biggest thing when it comes to cybersecurity, RMS, in the DoD is really, do good system security engineering. Think through problems, do risk assessments, document the outcomes, and be honest. So our leadership can make the best decisions for their community. And we've really got to start looking, one, at training people better, and two, making more mission-focused decisions when it comes to cybersecurity and risk management in the DoD.
So putting the mission first and putting RMF and all these other things in a supporting role, not making them the point of the work that we do. I absolutely agree with that. Rebecca, if anybody wanted to contact you, after they listen to this episode, would that be okay? And how would you like them to do that?
Absolutely. And you can email me. It's Becca, BECCA at iCyberI.com, International Cyber Institute. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. Is by email.
And that's the name of your organization that you started, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. I just think that's fantastic. As a small business owner, I love meeting and talking to other small business owners. So thank you so much, Rebecca. Everybody, as with every episode that we create, you can access a full transcript of everything we talked about right on our website. And all you have to do is put www.yourcyberpath.com / and then just put the episode number. This is episode 83. Just put 83 in your favorite web browser, and then you'll be able to actually pull up the page dedicated to this episode and access all the show notes and all of the transcript. It's a complete transcript. You can also sign up for my mentor notes. Now, if you don't know what mentor notes are, every 2 weeks I send out an email, and I've about 500 words, and I just kind of tell you something that's going on for those of you trying to get into cybersecurity, something that's going on that I think will help you. And I focus on being very short, to the point, and practical. Listen, give it a try. You can unsubscribe anytime. There's no trouble with that. If you go to yourcyberpath.com, you'll find the sign up there. So, like I said, give it a try. But in any event, we're happy you were here. Thanks for listening. And we're going to see you next time on Your Cyberpath.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Your Cyberpath. Don't miss an episode. Press the subscribe button now. If you would like to learn more about how to get your dream cybersecurity job, then be sure to visit yourcyberpath.com, where you can access the show notes, search the archive of our top tips and tricks, and discover some fantastic bonus content.